Well, it's so great to be here with you. Jason, like you and I have gone back, knowing each other for quite a few years. We don't get to interact as much as I'd like, but every time we do, I feel like we're kind of on this journey in different parts of the country together. Tell us a little bit about you and your church.
Yeah, my name is Jason Min. I pastor a church in downtown Los Angeles called Citizens LA. We are an Asian American community. A lot of young working professionals, college students, but also a lot of young families, married couples as well. So I'm 40 and I am one of the older people in the church, so that should give you a general idea of our demographic.
Yeah, a biblical model. So Jason, I'm really excited to have this conversation with you. You lead an Asian American church in the Los Angeles area, a city that is oftentimes perceived as a mecca for Asian Americans, especially Korean Americans. But here's why, for me, the work that you do, especially as a distinctly Asian American church, that's also multi-ethnic, but distinctly Asian American church, is so important. A Pew study recently came out showing that there was a decline in Asian American the Christian population, about 8% drop over the last 10 years. We also know that of all the major racial groups, Asian Americans are the only group where we are not at churches that are predominantly or dominantly made up of our own population. So white people are at white churches, black people are at black churches, Latinos are at Latino churches. Asian Americans are at white churches, the majority. Beyond that, there is a major divide between, first generation Asian American church or immigrant type churches, and then second generation plus type of Asian American churches that are still kind of finding our way in terms of like who we are, what are we without the kind of immigrant generations as an active part of our church communities. Especially because there are language differences. We're primarily English speaking. We don't rely on the church as much for the social navigation and things like that.
Sure.
My other concern is that Asian American churches, it's not just the Asian American population that's on the decline, Asian American churches are on the decline. Even after the pandemic, anecdotally, what I'm hearing in a variety of cities, let's just name the Korean church, for example. It sounds like somewhere between a sixth and a third of Korean churches may have closed down throughout the country during the pandemic. Now, many of those are probably like 50 people or less, but when we don't have that many churches, that's significant. I don't know what the rest of the population, other ethnicities are. I'm curious why you choose to identify as an Asian American church, especially when there's a lot of conversation around, should we be an Asian American church? Should we not? Should we be a church that's for everyone that just happens to be Asian American? Why even go there?
Yeah, I mean, 5 years ago, I would not have characterized us as an Asian American church. So, I mean, that just shows you like my own journey that I've been on. I think the first thing is that it is true to who we are. Like that is who we are. We are a church made up of predominantly Asian Americans. So on one hand, I think that it's just the most honest depiction of who we are as a church. I would say the second big thing is like for my own healing. And what I mean by that is, I had to ask myself, like, why was it so hard to call us an Asian American church before, when that was, in fact, who we are? I look out every Sunday and it's a sea of Asian faces. Why was it so hard? And I realized that, like, deep inside there is this self-hatred that I've never addressed. And I think part of that is growing up. Part of that is like tied into my experience as an Asian American in a society that was not built for or catered to Asian Americans. And I think, yeah, like, it was interesting because anytime someone visited our church, I always apologized, and I always gave like 100 disclaimers about, hey, like, you're gonna see a whole bunch of Asian people there. I'm really sorry about that. And I asked myself, like, why are you always apologizing for that? I've never had a white person invite me to church and then apologize for their church being too white. I've never had a black friend invite me to their church and apologize for their church being too black. But there was always something about, like, inviting someone to our church where I felt like I was doing them a disservice by having them come into our community, you know? And then so much of our ministry was about, like, not othering the white person. And it was like, what kind of twisted thinking is that? Where, you know, like, I'm pastoring a church full of people who've pretty much been othered their entire lives, a lot of whom are second generation Korean Americans who, like, never felt a sense of home here, whose parents did not speak the language, did not understand the culture, who kind of grew up in this liminal space. And yet I'm still thinking about making the white person in our church feel comfortable. And it's not a matter of, like, let's disregard the other, but it's like, what is it about Asian Americans that make us, like, so afraid to be Asian American and to be unabashedly Asian American and lean into that, you know? And I realize that like has ripple effects everywhere. When you don't own the fact that that is your church, it changes the way you preach. Like, the moment I said, I'm preaching to Asian Americans every week, it changed the way I prep sermons, it changed the examples that I gave, it changed the stories that I told. You know, it changes the way, it changes certain kinds of language that we use. Like, for example, like, I'll give you something really small. At our church, we don't talk about spiritual disciplines. We talk about spiritual practices because we know the word disciplines is a triggering word for Asian Americans. You know, we don't talk about obligation. It's usually an invitation, you know? So there are these, like, small contextualized shifts that we can make once we're first willing to own that is our identity, you know? And so, you know, that's been my own personal journey. And, you know, again, this is nothing against multiracial, multicultural churches. I think there's a place for that. But again, when you've grown up in a time when being a homogenous, or what was perceived as homogenous, let me put it that way, because even among Asian American, there's such a diversity there. But growing up where that was always seen as the JV, and then multicultural, which usually meant white leader with compositional diversity in your congregation, that being varsity, like, you're always feeling that sense of inferiority. And so I think that's probably why I was so afraid to say it before, but why I'm more willing to own it now, you know? And so, yeah.
That's really good. And I mean, to your point, you know, I think it's around 70 to 80%. I think it's closer to 70% of all multi-ethnic churches in the U.S. are white-led. They might be multi-ethnic, but they're oftentimes monocultural. If they're multicultural, it's not because the cultures are actually integrating or rubbing against each other in meaningful ways, but they're annexed to the side in some sort of ethnic enclave or ethnic ghetto. And so what you're saying is absolutely right. Now, your church is what percentage non-Asian?
I'd say like 5%.
Okay. So let's say that your church becomes, you know, what the standard is 20%. Let's say it becomes a 20% non-Asian church as an Asian American pastor and as an Asian American church. Do you think something would change there? Do you think you would stay the same? What, let's say 80% of the congregation is still Asian American. What do you think would happen then?
I think I would still identify as an Asian American community. I'm sure, like, as the, you know, one thing I'm realizing about pastoring is, like, as the church changes, like, numerically and in terms of, like, compositionally, it definitely changed. Everything plays a part in how I pastor and how I speak to our congregation. So I can't say with certainty exactly how that might impact the language, but, like, pretty much where we are right now, I'm pretty confident, like, we're fully, like, owning the fact that we're an Asian American church. And I think more and more what I've noticed, and I don't know if this has been your experience, but, like, for the first time, it feels like there are people who are looking for an Asian American church. And that is like mind blowing to me as well, where people who move to LA ask and they say, we're specifically looking for an Asian American church. And like it's very interesting and really encouraging for me, and one moment when I saw that like really clearly was the Atlanta shootings, and it was interesting because prior to that, I felt like there were people who had left our church wanting to look for what they, more multicultural spaces because it was starting to feel too Asian. And they went, and again, it was like this promise of like, we're gonna be a church for everyone. The Atlanta shootings happened, and they were like, it was like we were invisible. They needed us for their diversity metrics, but when it came down to our community really needing support and needing to feel seen in that time, like nobody saw us, nobody talked about it, was never mentioned from the pulpit, and this was something that was like traumatic for our community. And it was in that time, it felt like the sheen or like of that promise had waned, and people were like, you know what, I want to go to a church where I don't have to explain myself, where I'm not the source of education for everyone around, where I can just be me and feel seen, feel validated. And so we actually got an influx of Asian Americans during that time, and I want to nuance that by saying like, there's nothing that we do, I think right now inherently that is like, if you're not Asian American, don't come here. Or like, it's more so that like, we understand who we are. And I think there's a growing comfort level with that, and a growing confidence, even as an Asian American pastor, I can say that I used to think like, okay, I'm going to pastor a church in spite of my Asianness, like this is a hindrance to me pastoring, but I'll do the best that I can. Versus now I find myself more willing to embrace the idea that maybe the fact that I'm Asian American is a gift to my church. Maybe that there is something that I bring to the table with my experiences and my specific story and my place in American society at large that can actually be a part of my congregation's discipleship, and their faith. And so that's been really an eye-opening journey for me.
Yeah, that's really good. And I'll add to, and affirm everything you just said, especially because, after the Atlanta shootings, the number of calls, both from Asian Americans and non-Asian Americans or Asian American pastors and non-Asian American pastors with Asian Americans in their churches that said, I thought that the whole anti-Asian racism and violence, you guys are blowing it out of proportion. And then I was taken to the carpet by my congregants, especially my female congregants, the women congregants, who said, how could you not address this when you were addressing this and this and this and this, your issues that affect your community, but you won't address the things that affect us who are in your community. And so I totally agree with you in the sense that I think more people were looking for a space where they knew that the community would care for them in a very visible and tangible manner. And then I also think, we're kind of in this unique, we're both Korean American, and we're in this unique kind of stage where we're seeing more Asian American, not adequate, but more Asian American representation in media. And then the waves from Asia, like through K-pop and
K-dramas.
K-dramas and Bollywood, like they're shaping the imagination. So like even when I went to a BTS concert a few years ago, everyone around me was speaking Korean, but I was like the only Korean there.
That's right.
And I was like, this is amazing. Like this is what I wish church was like.
Yes. No, it was interesting. Shout out to Professor Daniel Lee. He called me out on this once. Like he was like, you spent like 10 minutes of your sermon unpacking a New York Times article. And he was like, that's great, that's fine. He's like, you mentioned BTS on a whim But he's like, but did you see what happened to the congregation? Like, they were in it with you, but you went right past that. And he was kind of like, why did you, what was it about that? And it made me really reflect, like, like for me, again, growing up in a Western scholastic kind of spirituality, like the New York Times example is like, which really is like the white example,
Yes.
And then that is like the legitimate example.
Mm-hmm.
The BTS thing is a whimsical example.
Yeah.
But it's like, in a moment you realize like, oh, like this is who I'm ministering to. They were eating that up,
Yeah.
and they wanted more,
Yes.
and so like those are small moments when like I have to check my own self-hatred, my constant repressing of my Asian American identity, and so yeah, I mean I'm in the journey right now.
Yeah.
So I'm definitely still growing and still developing, I think.
And I think all of us are, right? I
Yeah.
don't think anyone's like, I mean, even the experts aren't fully experts, because I mean, the diaspora of Asian America, the Asian diaspora in the US is so broad, and every time you turn a corner, you're learning something new about a new community that you thought you knew, but you didn't realize how nuanced and beautiful it was.
That's
and
right.
so and then all of our communities are treated slightly differently because of our immigration patterns and
Yes.
where we are in the country and how we've interacted with the broader society. And so that's I'm like, we should, and the fact that it's like we should all be on a journey. My concern is that there's a lot of us that don't want to be on that journey.
That's right.
Or are planting our feet and refusing to take that first step.
Sure.
What do you say to people like that?
Yeah, I mean, one, I think I have a lot of empathy, because I think I was there, and for a long time I, put my the Asian American side of me, or the Asian side of me, let's say, like on the back burner. And so I understand, because again, it's almost like if you've been trained to move through society in one way your whole life, and there was one kind of pathway for you to be successful and thrive, whatever that means, and that pathway was pretty much like your parents handed you the blueprint. Like, you have to be like this in order to. I can understand why it would be so hard. Then you almost feel like you're regressing, And so I do have a lot of empathy, but I do feel like we will miss out, I think, on the gift that Asian American Christians can be to the church, and in this specific moment, if we're unwilling to lean into that side of our identity. I think there are so many things that, for example, like in a time where we talk about this a lot, right? Like that it feels like ministry is moving from content-based models to connection-based models. I mean, who does that better than Asian Americans in terms of community, in terms of connecting people relationally? That's all we saw growing up. That was what church was. It was a village. It was a community for our parents. In this time,
And for us.
and for us,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
for us, yeah. And in this time, like when everything is black and white, and you go on Twitter and everything is drawing lines in the sand, who better than to know what it's like to live in liminal spaces, right? To live in paradox, to be kind of here but not really, be kind of here but not really, and you almost there's nothing that replaces that lived experience in terms of how we can navigate the very like black and white world that we live in a way that's non-dualistic, non-binary. And so I do think there are so many things that in this moment, I mean, I think you talked about this earlier, that they're talking about the next gen being predominantly minorities, and I think there's something about being Asian American and people willing to embrace that identity that can be such an asset for the future of the church.
That's good. So, there's a lot of churches, especially Asian American churches, probably more than any other community, that doesn't want to be known as an Asian American church. They're like, yeah, we're a gospel church made up of many Asian Americans, or we are a neighborhood church, that has that has a majority Asian Americans, or I mean, we might be a Bible believing church that's all Asian American.
Sure.
But we don't want to be known as an Asian American church,
Sure.
or we definitely don't want people to think of us as an Asian American. What would you say to pastors who are kind of thinking along those lines?
Yeah, I mean, I would definitely encourage pastors to do their own self-examination, kind of like how I did. And I can't say that I would know all the different reasons a person would want to identify their church a certain way, but at least I would do the work of asking why. Why do you feel very reluctant to call yourself an Asian American community? And I think a lot of times behind the answer to that question is where you realize, like, oh man, there's stuff I haven't processed, about my own culture, about my own identity, And so how are you gonna, in some sense, right? Like, and I know at 10 by 10 talks about this a lot, like, the core needs of every person is identity, belonging, purpose, And if I, as a pastor, that is a big part of my role in shepherding people into their identity, belonging, and purpose. If I myself am not comfortable with my own Asian American identity, how am I going to do that? And so
that's really good. As you're looking towards the future, and we're talking about how there's a decline in the Asian American church. Younger generations are leaving, not just the church, but again, disaffiliating from the church. Like, they don't even want to identify as a Christian or identify with Jesus. Why do you think the Asian American church needs to exist?
Well, one, I think, man, that's such a layered, complex question. I think the Asian American church needs to exist because Asian Americans matter to God. I think Asian Americans are made in the image of God, and I think Asian Americans, more than most others, are still uncomfortable fully owning that, and believing that they, with all of their Asian Americanness, matter to God.
Yeah.
That they are not there to serve someone else's, mattering to God, but that we ourselves matter to God. And so, and I do think there are particularities about us that are beautiful and unique, and that are not liabilities, but are assets. And so I think we need communities that can speak to that, and that can help people grow in that identity.
That's good. Well, thanks for joining me. This is great. And if you're looking for a church in the LA area, check out Citizens LA. I used to be a part of the church, and I wish I could still be, but I live in Chicago. And how can people connect with you if they want to find you?
You can visit our website, citizensla.org. Come check out one of our Sunday services. Would love to meet you.
Yeah.